What if I told you that over 3 days, a small Pennsylvania town became the site of the bloodiest battle in American history? The Battle of Gettysburg wasn't just a clash of armies. It was the turning point of the Civil War, one of sacrifice, resilience, and staggering human loss. How did this chaotic, brutal struggle end up shaping the future of a nation? What was life like for those who gave their all to fight for their beliefs? And what moments of unimaginable heroism defined it? Listen carefully, because the answers are nothing short of haunting. Welcome back, everyone. Glad to see you again. If you enjoy these videos, be sure to leave a like, comment where you're tuning in from, and subscribe for more tales like this one. Now, take a deep breath, relax, and enjoy this stroll through history. Imagine a country so divided that entire states are ripped from the fabric of the Union, where neighbours find themselves on opposite sides of a bloody conflict. That was America in 1863. The Civil War had been raging for over 2 years, leaving a trail of devastation across the South and casting a grim shadow over the North. Despite the Union's larger population and industrial power, the Confederacy had proven to be a formidable opponent, delivering victory after victory on battlefields where courage collided with chaos. Bloody skirmishes weren't the exception. They were the norm. And yet, there was no clear end to the war in sight. In the early years, the Confederacy had a knack for defensive warfare. Their generals, particularly Robert E. Lee, had built a reputation for outmaneuvering larger Union armies. Lee's victories at places like Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville weren't just tactical, they were psychological. They made the Confederate cause seem not only determined but terrifyingly capable. For many in the North, it felt as though every battle dragged the war out further, pushing ultimate victory further into an uncertain future. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, despite being outnumbered and stretched thin, achieved what seemed impossible time and again. This created a sense of invincibility around Lee and his soldiers, even as hunger, exhaustion, and losses began to weigh them down. But Robert E. Lee wasn't sitting content with defending Southern soil. By the summer of 1863, he hatched a plan to take the fight to Union territory. The idea wasn't just about winning a battle, it was about making a statement. Lee saw it as a chance to force the Union to sue for peace. After all, if his army could strike a powerful blow on their home turf, maybe Abraham Lincoln's government would have no choice but to negotiate. Meanwhile, voices calling for peace in the North were growing louder, worn down by a war that showed no end and loss that felt endless. Lee hoped to bolster that sentiment by delivering a crushing defeat far from Southern soil, but there was also practicality behind Lee's invasion of the North. Over 2 years of conflict had stripped the South bare. Virginia, where much of the war's fiercest fighting had taken place, resembled a wasteland. Crops were ruined, towns burned, and supply shortages were strangling the Confederate war effort. An invasion of Pennsylvania, the heart of Union territory, offered something the desperate Confederates needed: food and supplies. Lee's men would live off the land, collecting whatever they could from northern farms and towns. It wasn't a polite request either. They weren't there to bargain. They were there to take what they needed. Imagine watching helplessly as soldiers swept through your barn, loading up your livestock and hauling away your grain, their rifles slung over their shoulders, a bitter image of war's reality for those caught in its path. It wasn't just about supplies, though. If Lee's campaign succeeded, and his army devastated the Union on their own soil, it might convince foreign nations, like Britain and France, that the Confederacy was worth supporting. Recognition from powerful European countries could mean loans, weapons, even troops, all of which were lifelines the Confederacy desperately needed. This wasn't just a military campaign, it was a gamble with political and economic stakes that could redefine the war. Of course, no plan survives contact with the enemy, and Lee's invasion began to face serious hurdles almost immediately. His army, though experienced and motivated, was stretched thin. Tens of thousands of men moved through Pennsylvania without full knowledge of where the Union Army even was. Jeb Stuart, Lee's cavalry commander known for his daring raids, had taken much of his force on an extended operation, leaving Lee almost blind when it came to intelligence. Think about it. An army wandering deep in enemy territory without knowing where the opposing forces are gathering. It's like walking blindfolded into a room, not knowing if it's empty or full of people waiting to attack. Meanwhile, the Union Army wasn't exactly sitting idle. After the devastating defeat at Chancellorsville in May, Lincoln replaced the hesitant General Joseph Hooker with General George Meade, just days before the showdown at Gettysburg. Meade found himself in charge of an army still licking its wounds but determined to stop Lee's advance. The Army of the Potomac wasn't just fighting for paychecks or pride, they were holding the line for the Union itself. Defeat could mean Confederate troops marching all the way to Washington, D.C., or possibly even New York. The stakes were monumental, and while armies clashed, the war's toll on civilians couldn't be ignored. Entire towns became battlefields overnight, families fleeing their homes or hiding in basements as shell fire tore through their communities. Crops were trampled, towns were ransacked, and the scars of battle remained long after the armies moved on. By 1863, the Civil War wasn't just a fight between soldiers, it was a fight that dragged an entire nation into its orbit. For Lee, the Pennsylvania invasion was a high-stakes roll of the dice. He knew his men were weary, hunger gnawed at them, and morale wavered in the ranks. But his army also carried the momentum of victory, expecting yet another triumph. To boost this confidence even further, Confederate forces carried out punitive actions along the way, recruiting hundreds of free African Americans from Pennsylvania towns and forcing them into slavery, a horrifying reminder of what the Confederacy fought to preserve. Every step of this campaign brought Lee closer to the confrontation he sought. But this wasn't a controlled march toward destiny. His army was dispersed across miles of countryside, taking small towns under occupation and spreading further away from coordinated control. As Confederate soldiers moved closer to Gettysburg, they weren't chasing glory. They were chasing goods, raiding supply depots and emptying farms. The North was as much a supply line as it was a battlefield, but Lee's invasion, calculated as it was, depended on luck, and luck is a fickle companion in war. On June 30th, elements of his army stumbled into Union cavalry just outside of Gettysburg. What began as an incidental clash over supplies would grow into something unimaginable. One side scrambled to gain the upper hand in an accidental first encounter, while the other began positioning for the fight of their lives. Nobody at that moment, or even in the first hours, could have guessed they were witnessing the beginning of the bloodiest battle ever fought on American soil. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Lee was betting it all. His army, his strategy, even the Confederacy itself, on this campaign. If Virginia was going to recover, if the South was ever going to win this war, Gettysburg had to deliver. On the other side, the Union was equally desperate. They could not afford another defeat. Too much blood had already been spilled. Now, armies were converging on a small Pennsylvania town that none of them could have picked out on a map a week earlier. What followed wasn't just a battle. It was the moment when everything would change. Soldiers who had marched hundreds of miles, stolen whatever brief moments of sleep they could grab in muddy fields and crowded encampments, would soon find themselves caught in the vortex of history. What if one of the most pivotal battles in history started by pure coincidence? July 1st, 1863, wasn't supposed to be a day for legend. Confederate troops had been moving through the Pennsylvania countryside on what was essentially a scavenging mission. They were hungry, desperate, and in dire need of supplies. In fact, one goal was as humble as it gets: shoes. That's right. Much of Lee's army was marching barefoot, so when Major General Henry Heth's division heard that Gettysburg might have stockpiles of supplies, footwear included, they naturally headed that way. They had no idea they were walking straight toward Union cavalry. Meanwhile, Union Brigadier General John Buford had his own priorities. He'd taken his cavalry ahead of the Army of the Potomac to scout the area. What he found in Gettysburg was more than just a quiet town. He saw something that made every soldier's instinct kick in: high ground. The ridges surrounding Gettysburg could mean the difference between life and death for an army. Hare Ridge, McPherson Ridge, Seminary Ridge, Cemetery Hill. They weren't just landmarks. They were potential strongholds. Buford knew that if the Confederates got there first, the Union would be fighting an uphill battle in more ways than one. So he acted quickly, ordering his men to dig in and hold their positions, buying time until the main force arrived. As the early morning sun rose on July 1st, Heth's men approached Gettysburg, expecting maybe a skirmish with some local militia or no resistance at all. Instead, they ran right into Buford's cavalry. The first shots cracked through the air around 7:30 a.m., the opening volley of what would become the bloodiest battle in American history. Lieutenant Marcellus Jones of the 8th Illinois Cavalry is often credited with firing the first shot, but when the real fighting began, it escalated fast. What started as sporadic gunfire between scouting parties quickly turned into something much bigger. Buford's cavalry found themselves outnumbered and fighting to hold back an overwhelming Confederate advance. His men were armed with breech-loading carbines, faster to reload than the muskets the Confederate infantry carried. But speed meant nothing against sheer numbers. They knew their mission wasn't to win outright, but to slow the Confederates down long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Buford described it as a race against time, and his men fought with that urgency, digging into positions along McPherson Ridge to stall Heth's advance. Every second counted. By mid-morning, Heth had grown impatient. He sent wave after wave of infantry toward the Union cavalry, pushing hard to break through and take the town. At first, the Confederate troops tried direct assaults, marching straight into rifle fire. The bullets cracked and whined through the air, tearing through men and leaving the fields littered with bodies. With each wave, Buford's men fell back slowly, but they were methodical, stretching the fight out as long as they could. Union reinforcements weren't just coming, they were racing, and they made it just in time. Around late morning, soldiers from the Union's 1st Corps under Major General John Reynolds arrived on the field. Ironically, Reynolds never saw what would become the largest battle of his career. As he rode near the front lines to rally his men, a sharpshooter's bullet cut him down. Even for seasoned troops, seeing a beloved general fall was shattering, but Reynolds' men didn't break. If anything, his death ignited a furious response. Union soldiers threw themselves into the fight, crashing against the Confederate advance and inflicting heavy casualties. Throughout the afternoon, the fighting only intensified. Confederate reinforcements poured in, with troops from A.P. Hill's and Richard Ewell's corps flooding the battlefield. The Union forces found themselves stretched thin, holding position after position until they couldn't anymore. By early evening, the overwhelming Confederate numbers finally forced the Union into a retreat. Their soldiers fell back through the streets of Gettysburg, some firing as they went, others fleeing for their lives. Civilians slammed their doors and shuttered windows as gunfire erupted in their once quiet town. The chaos swallowed the streets. Confederates firing from alleys, Union soldiers scrambling for cover, wounded men crying out from backyards and orchards now scarred by cannon fire. But the retreat wasn't random or panicked. It was a tactical fallback to higher ground. Cemetery Hill, south of town. This spot, already recognized by Buford earlier that morning as one of the most defensible locations in the area, would now act as the backbone of the Union's defensive line. From here, Union forces could dig in and regroup for the battles yet to come. It wasn't a victory, but it gave them something just as valuable, an opportunity. Losing the first day didn't mean losing the war. As night fell, both sides prepared for what they knew would be an even bloodier day ahead. Confederate soldiers camped in and around Gettysburg, filling homes and barns, while their commanders plotted their next moves. General Lee, encouraged by the day's gains, decided to press the advantage. His army had the numbers and had pushed the Union back. It seemed logical to strike again while morale was high. However, one key decision missed by General Ewell would haunt the Confederacy later. Lee had ordered Ewell to take Cemetery Hill if practicable, a vague command that left room for interpretation. Ewell, after surveying the daunting Union defences and considering how exhausted his men were, chose not to attack. Whether it was caution or exhaustion guiding his judgment, one thing was clear. Missing the chance to take that high ground essentially handed it to the Union, giving them a platform to anchor their defences. For the soldiers who had fought and bled on July 1st, the echoes of musket fire and the pounding cannon were far from over. The battered Union troops may have fallen back, but they had saved their strength for the next round. Cemetery Hill wasn't just high ground. It offered a psychological edge, a rallying point for soldiers who would fight as though everything depended on holding it. Because it did. Gettysburg wasn't supposed to happen this way. Neither side planned for it, but in the unpredictable world of war, plans crumble under the weight of real events. A desperate search for supplies, an opportunistic cavalry scout, a sharpshooter's bullet. These tiny, seemingly insignificant moments collided to spark something monumental. As the sun set over Gettysburg, both armies could feel it in their bones. The fight was far from over. What started as chance was now a battle destined to change everything. The next day would bring brutal combat, and heroes whose deeds would be remembered for generations. July 2nd wasn't just another day of fighting. It was chaos, desperation, and sheer exhaustion, woven into 24 brutal hours. At dawn, the Union forces had established themselves in a defensive position along high ground, stretching from Culp's Hill on their right flank, hooking south across Cemetery Hill, and extending down Seminary Ridge to a rocky hill at the southern tip called Little Round Top. The line curved like a fishhook, compact enough for easy communication, but tough enough to hold thanks to the elevation. For the Confederates, looking up at those ridges meant one thing. If they wanted to win, they would have to fight uphill. The day's plan came straight from Robert E. Lee. He believed that by attacking both flanks of the Union line, his army could collapse the Union position like a crumpled tin can. General James Longstreet's corps was tasked with hitting the Union's left flank, rolling north along the Emmitsburg Road toward the center of the fishhook. On the right, Confederate forces would hammer positions at Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill. Lee figured that overwhelming two weak points could scatter the Union Army, leaving the field wide open for his troops to finish the job. Bold, yes, but also risky, because Lee's men were spread thin, stretched over a 5-mile-long battlefield. Communication would be slow, reinforcements would be slower, timing would need to be perfect. Perfect, however, wasn't what happened. Delays dogged Longstreet's men as they marched into position. The Union, meanwhile, had scrambled to reinforce their left flank where they sensed trouble brewing. Confederate troops didn't get moving until mid-afternoon, and by the time they did, the Union wasn't an easy target anymore. They were ready. The first clash of the day erupted at a place named Devil's Den. It was a rugged, boulder-strewn section of ground that looked like something out of a nightmare. Confederate soldiers, led by Major General John Bell Hood, stormed the area with brutal determination. Pushing forward through a mess of rocks and gunfire, they fought Union troops tooth and nail, only to find themselves bogged down in a chaotic, bloody contest over this rocky hill. The fighting in Devil's Den was so ferocious, so messy, that the nearby valley earned its grim nickname, the Valley of Death. The scene was a fever dream of smoke, sharp cracks of musket fire, and screams. When the dust settled, the Confederates had driven the Union forces out of Devil's Den, but it had cost them dearly. The ground wasn't just soaked with sweat, it was soaked with blood. But Devil's Den wasn't the prize Lee cared about most. That hill, Little Round Top, anchored the entire southern tip of the Union line. If the Confederates could take it, they could rain artillery fire down the length of the Union position. Hood's men surged forward toward the rocky slope, clambering over boulders as Union soldiers scrambled to form a defense. Waiting for them was a thin but stubborn band of soldiers that included the 20th Maine Regiment under Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. If you know anything about Little Round Top, you know how this story goes, or at least you think you do. Chamberlain's orders that day were simple but daunting. Hold the hill at all costs. He knew that if his men fell back, the entire Union line could unravel. As the Confederates attacked, wave after wave came up the hill, fierce and unrelenting. The men of the 20th Maine were outnumbered, fighting a battle of nerves just as much as muscle. Smoke choked the air around them as volleys of musket fire tore through the lines. Still, Chamberlain's men held firm, clutching the hill like their lives depended on it, because they truly did. By late afternoon, the situation turned dire. The Union soldiers ran dangerously low on ammunition. Chamberlain faced a nightmarish choice: send his exhausted and outgunned men down the hill in a desperate bid to attack, or hold out and risk annihilation. He chose the first option. Ordering his men to attach bayonets, he shouted for a charge. Imagine the chaos. Soldiers screaming as they hurled themselves downhill, muskets angled like spears, running straight into Confederate forces who had no idea what hit them. The gamble worked. Chamberlain's audacity paid off, and his men drove Hood's troops back, securing the Union left flank and saving Little Round Top. That single bayonet charge may have prevented the collapse of the Union line entirely. While Chamberlain's men fought tooth and nail on Little Round Top, other parts of the battlefield were engulfed in their own horrors. The peach orchard, just north of Devil's Den, became a killing ground as Confederate forces hit the Union line with explosive fury. Union defenders crumpled under the assault, and the Confederate troops surged forward, leaving the peach orchard littered with bodies and churned soil. Nearby, the wheat field turned into what can only be described as hell on earth. Control of the field changed hands 6 different times in just a matter of hours. Soldiers fought so fiercely that at the end of the day, the field held no winners, only human tragedy. When the fighting stopped, over 4,000 men lay dead or wounded among the trampled crops. That's not a battlefield, that's a graveyard. As the fighting rippled across these different hotspots, the casualty count skyrocketed. More than 20,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured in the span of a single day. Think about that. In just 24 hours, entire regiments were wiped out. Fields and hillsides turned into charnel houses. The noise of battle never stopped. Artillery thundered, muskets cracked, and orders rang out, mixing with the screams of the dying. For civilians watching from afar, the toll must have been unimaginable. And for the soldiers on the ground, it was personal chaos. Every explosion, every gunshot, every comrade who fell beside them, it was a day burned into their memories forever. Still, the Union hadn't crumbled. Despite holding on to their line by the barest of margins, they remained solid enough to fight another day. The Confederate effort on July 2nd had been aggressive, immense, and costly, but it had failed to break the Union, and that was critical. The fishhook formation still held, anchored by Cemetery Hill and Little Round Top despite the heavy toll. The Union line bent and strained under Confederate attacks, but it did not snap. As the sun set over Gettysburg, silence finally began to creep across the battlefield. Soldiers on both sides sat among the carnage, counting themselves lucky to have survived. But nobody was resting easy. The Confederates had made significant gains in some areas, but failed in their larger goal of shattering the Union defences. Meanwhile, Union troops, battered but intact, spent the night digging in for what they knew would come next. July 3rd loomed ahead, and with it the final desperate gambles of Lee's campaign. So far, neither side had delivered a decisive blow, but Lee wasn't ready to retreat. He planned to finish this with one last massive gamble, aimed at the heart of the Union line. What neither he nor his men could fully grasp yet was just how much worse it was going to get. What drives a man to march into certain death? That's not an abstract question. It's what thousands of Confederate soldiers wrestled with as they prepared for what would become one of the most infamous events in the history of warfare. The morning of July 3rd, 1863 dawned hot and still, the air heavy with the smell of gunpowder and earth churned up by cannon fire. The Confederate army, battered yet determined, regrouped after 2 punishing days of fighting. Robert E. Lee believed victory was still within reach. He was convinced that if one final, massive assault could punch through the Union lines, the Army of the Potomac would collapse. It was the kind of moment that made or broke empires. Unfortunately for the Confederacy, this gamble would break theirs. Lee's plan was as daring as it was simple, a massive frontal assault against the Union center on Cemetery Ridge. Why the center, though? Because Lee thought the Union flanks already hammered on July 2nd were reinforced and more difficult to breach. But the center, if that broke, it could split the Union line in half, opening the door for Confederate forces to sweep in and annihilate what remained. It was all or nothing, and Lee was willing to risk everything on this final push. His seasoned lieutenant, James Longstreet, wasn't so sure. Longstreet argued that such an attack, over nearly a mile of open ground, was suicide. But Lee would not be swayed. He ordered Longstreet to make it happen. The attack was to be led by General George Pickett's division, alongside brigades from A.P. Hill's corps. In total, about 12,500 Confederate soldiers would participate in what would later be called Pickett's Charge. Not that anyone there that day would have had the luxury of naming it. Before the infantry even began their march, Lee devised what he thought was a critical first step. An artillery bombardment meant to smash the Union line, weakening the defences and causing the Union soldiers to panic. By mid-afternoon, more than 150 Confederate cannons opened fire, unleashing the largest artillery barrage of the entire Civil War. For nearly 2 hours the battlefield thundered with cannon blasts, the ground trembling under the weight of the bombardment. Civilians in Gettysburg later described the sound as a continuous roar, as though the heavens themselves were being ripped apart. But while the display was terrifying, it was also tragically ineffective. Most of the Confederate cannons aimed too high, their shots sailing over Union positions and exploding harmlessly behind Cemetery Ridge. The Union, meanwhile, held their fire, conserving their ammunition for what they knew was coming next. Then came the march. When the artillery fell silent, Pickett's men stepped into formation. The soldiers lined up shoulders to shoulder, rifles held at the ready, banners unfurling in the light Pennsylvania breeze. In total, they would have to cross about 3/4 of a mile of open farmland, all of it under the watchful gaze of Union artillery and troops entrenched behind a stone wall at the ridge's summit. Despite the grave odds, the Confederate soldiers moved forward with chilling precision. For the first stretch, things were almost calm. There was no immediate response from the Union positions. Some soldiers might have even felt a glimmer of hope, as the Union line stayed unnervingly quiet. Then the cannons roared to life. Union artillery opened fire with deadly accuracy. Shells exploded above and among the Confederate ranks, ripping through men and sending bodies flying. Soldiers who survived the blast stumbled forward, stepping over the dead and dying, the neat rows of their formation beginning to break apart. As they advanced, Union commanders rotated their artillery to hit the Confederate flanks, sending even more devastation into the broad swath of men crossing the field. And it wasn't just the cannons. As the Confederates crept closer to Cemetery Ridge, they were met with musket fire from infantry who'd been lying in wait behind the stone wall. Still, the Confederates pressed on. Their determination was almost unimaginable, men charging forward even as their friends and comrades fell around them, the air thick with smoke and the acrid stench of burning powder. By the time they reached the base of the hill, their numbers were a fraction of what they had been at the start of the assault. Small groups managed to ascend the ridge and engage in brutal hand-to-hand combat with Union defenders. Brigadier General Lewis A. Armistead, leading his men with sword raised high, managed to break through the stone wall at a section known as the Angle. For a brief, fleeting moment, it seemed as though the Confederates might succeed. But the Union reinforcements came faster and in greater numbers than the Confederates could handle. What happened next was nothing less than a slaughter. Trapped at the crest of the ridge, the Confederate attackers were overwhelmed by a tidal wave of Union soldiers. Armistead himself was shot down, dying shortly after the battle, and the few remaining Confederate forces who had reached the wall were either killed or captured. Those who hadn't made it to the top began a hasty retreat under relentless fire. At that moment, Pickett's charge became what it is remembered as today, a tragic spectacle of futility. In the aftermath, the field between Cemetery Ridge and the Confederate line was a nightmare. Thousands of bodies littered the ground, many lying where they had fallen, their bright uniforms and flags standing out against the churned-up earth. Of the roughly 12,500 men who started the charge, over 6,000 were killed, wounded, or captured, a casualty rate of nearly 60%. George Pickett himself, upon being ordered to rally his division, reportedly responded, "I have no division." It wasn't just his division that was broken, it was the entire spirit of Lee's army. Lee, for his part, took full responsibility for the disaster. As his shattered troops limped back to their lines, he was reported to have said, "It's all my fault." Despite this admission, the damage couldn't be undone. Lee had gambled everything on Pickett's charge, and he had lost. The psychological blow to the Confederacy was immense. For so long, Lee had seemed invincible, his army almost untouchable. After Gettysburg, that illusion was shattered. For the Union, this was nothing short of a turning point. Not only had they held their ground, but they had inflicted devastating losses on the Confederates. The victory gave the Union soldiers a renewed sense of hope and purpose, proof that they could stand toe-to-toe with Lee's army and come out on top. It also marked a critical moment in the war itself. Pickett's charge was not just a failed assault, it was the high watermark of the Confederacy. Never again would the South come as close to victory as they did that day on the fields of Gettysburg. As the sun set on July 3rd, 1863, the battlefield was eerily quiet, the fighting finally over. For the tens of thousands of Union and Confederate dead, however, peace had come too late. And for the survivors, the sight of what lay around them was enough to burn the memory of Gettysburg into their minds forever. How do you even begin to honour the dead when the ground itself still trembles with the memory of war? A few months after Gettysburg, the battlefield still carried the weight of what had happened there. The broken fences, the half-filled graves, the echoes of cannon fire, all of it haunted the small Pennsylvania town. By November 1863, the site was being transformed into the Soldiers' National Cemetery, a solemn resting place for Union soldiers who had given everything to hold that ground. And it was here, amid this sacred effort to bring order to chaos, that President Abraham Lincoln delivered his most famous speech, the Gettysburg Address. The ceremony itself wasn't some coordinated national spectacle. It was, by design, a humble event, a gathering to recognize the incredible cost of the battle and the humanity of the men buried there. Lincoln wasn't even the main speaker. That honor belonged to Edward Everett, a renowned orator who took the stage before Lincoln and delivered a grand 2-hour address. Picture the scene. Everett's booming voice rolling out over the crowd, his words full of rhetoric and detail, suitable for the 19th century idea of a proper dignified speech. And then, when he finally stepped down, Lincoln stood up. If you'd been there, you might have missed what happened next. Seriously, it's easy to imagine someone distractedly shifting in their seat, or a child tugging on their mother's dress, only to completely miss the moment. Lincoln kept it brief, just 272 words. That's shorter than the text on the back of some cereal boxes. Yet those 272 words reshaped how Americans thought about the war, their country, and the sacrifices made on that battlefield. It only took 2 minutes for Lincoln to redefine everything. When Lincoln began speaking, he didn't start with the usual pleasantries or acknowledgements. Instead, he took everyone back to the founding of the United States, back to what he called 77 years ago. That opening line alone carried a weight that must have made his audience sit up a little straighter. It wasn't just a reference to the past, it was a direct connection to the promises of the Declaration of Independence. Conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. That line by itself was a reminder of what was at stake. Equality wasn't just a lofty ideal, it was the core of what the Union was fighting to preserve, even as the war tested whether that ideal could survive. But Lincoln didn't linger in the past for long. He turned to the present, acknowledging the sheer scale of the sacrifices made at Gettysburg. without hesitation, he elevated the men who fought and died there above politics, above strategy. They had, in his words, given the last full measure of devotion. Lincoln made it clear that this battlefield wasn't just blood-soaked dirt. It had become hallowed ground, and not because of anything he or anyone else could say. We cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground, Lincoln admitted. That work, he argued, had already been done by the men whose blood had soaked into the earth. What stands out in Lincoln's address is how he framed the war itself. Up until then, for many Americans, the war had been about preserving the Union, holding the country together, preventing its collapse under the weight of division. But Lincoln took it a step further. He called the war a test of whether a nation so conceived and so dedicated could endure. He wasn't just talking to the crowd gathered there. He was speaking to the soul of the country. The Union victory at Gettysburg, in his view, wasn't just a military win. It was proof that the fight wasn't in vain. It was about something bigger, something deeper. And then came what might be the most powerful idea of the entire speech, a new birth of freedom. Those 4 words have echoed ever since, redefining what the Civil War meant. It wasn't just a struggle to preserve what had existed before. It was a battle to rebuild the nation into something better, freer, and more just. The thing about the Gettysburg Address is how masterfully Lincoln balanced grief with resolve. He wasn't there to sugarcoat what had happened or to make the pain go away. Instead, he acknowledged it. He forced the country to look at the brutal cost of the fight, not just at Gettysburg, but across every battlefield in the Civil War. The dead could not have died in vain, he insisted. The Union had to ensure that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Those words weren't just lofty. They were a call to action. They demanded that the living honour the dead by finishing what they had started. The reaction to the speech was complicated. Remember, it was delivered in the middle of a war that still hung in the balance. Newspapers loyal to Lincoln's Republican Party praised it. One described it as having the eloquence of brevity. But his critics weren't as kind. Democratic papers mocked the address, calling it inadequate for such an important moment. It wasn't until later, after Lincoln's assassination, after the war ended, that the full weight of the Gettysburg Address began to sink in. One of Lincoln's contemporaries, Senator Charles Sumner, later said, "The world at once noted what he said, and will never cease to remember it." It's almost ironic when you think about it. Lincoln himself didn't think the speech would leave much of an impression. At one point he humbly remarked, "The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here." And yet his words have been etched into the soul of the nation. They've been quoted, memorized, and taught in classrooms for generations. The Gettysburg Address became more than just a speech. It became a symbol of what the Civil War meant, a reminder of the sacrifices made and the ideals worth fighting for. But beyond its political and historical impact, the Gettysburg Address is also deeply personal. It gave meaning to the chaos of war, to the thousands of soldiers buried beneath the grass of Gettysburg. Sure, politicians and historians debate its themes, dissect its phrasing. But for the men who buried their comrades or those who trudged away from the battlefield scarred and battered, those 272 words said what they needed to hear. It connected their sacrifices to something eternal, freedom, equality, and the promise of a better world. In the months and years that followed, Lincoln's words continued to inspire the Union's fight. They came to define not just why the war was fought, but why it mattered. Standing there on a battlefield that had seen more bloodshed than anyone could have imagined, he had brought clarity amid the chaos. The light he cast wasn't just for the people standing in front of him, it was for the future. A future where, hopefully, the nation would never again need such fields of sacrifice. And after those brief moments on the podium, Lincoln stepped away, leaving silence in his wake. For the soldiers and the civilians, for the families of the dead and the wounded who still clung to life, his message was both simple and profound. Now the burden was on the living to carry the fight forward, because history wasn't just written by the past, it was being written by those willing to fight for the dream of a better tomorrow, no matter the cost. Picture waking up in a damp canvas tent, your back sore from sleeping on the hard, uneven ground. The air smells faintly of mud, wet grass and smoke from last night's fire. It's quiet for a moment, but soon a bugle shatters the stillness, pulling you into the reality of another day in a Civil War camp. For a soldier, life wasn't just about battlefield heroics or dramatic charges. Most days were spent in a grinding cycle of routines, discomfort, and a constant fight against boredom, or worse, disease. The day typically began early, often around 6 in the morning. From there, the pattern was relentless. Drill, march, clean your weapon, repeat. Soldiers spent hours practicing formations and maneuvers, making sure they moved like clockwork when it mattered most. This might sound disciplined, and to some extent it was, but it also drove many men half mad. The boredom crept in like an unwelcome guest, suffocating any illusion of excitement. Activities like picketing or foraging were seen as rare escapes, even if they were just as exhausting. And then there was the monotony of camp life itself. In those moments when they weren't drilling, soldiers had to wrestle with how to pass the time. Letter writing became more than just a way to communicate, it was a lifeline. The armies, surprisingly literate for the time, leaned heavily on these written connections to keep them tied to their families, their friends, and the world they left behind. Soldiers traded newspapers just to get scraps of news, whether that meant hearing about the next big battle, rumours of European nations watching the war, or even what was happening back in their hometowns. Sometimes they didn't just exchange news, they traded with the enemy. Southern troops were desperate for coffee, while Northern soldiers wanted Southern tobacco. Yes, just imagine soldiers who had hours earlier been trying to kill each other now bartering like overly aggressive neighbours at a yard sale. Entertainment was crucial for survival. Not physical survival, but mental. Camp was overwhelmingly male, and distractions range from rowdy to heartfelt. Soldiers drank, gambled, swore and smoked, playing cards deep into the evenings. They also organised things like debate societies. Can you imagine sitting in a tent, passionately arguing politics with someone who hadn't bathed in days? Music was the most popular escape. Songs reminded the men of home, helping them cling to some sense of normalcy, even as they lived surrounded by chaos and death. Other times they wrestled, raced horses, and even boxed for entertainment. Sports offered a temporary reprieve, something to let them feel human for a while. But any semblance of balance or routine disintegrated in the face of constant threats to their health. Disease ravaged both the Union and Confederate armies. Forget bullets. Disease was the real killer of the Civil War, causing over half the total casualties. Most soldiers came from isolated rural towns and farms, where they had little immunity to the illnesses they'd encounter in crowded camps. Tuberculosis, typhoid, malaria, each of these swept through regiments like wildfire. Hygiene standards were non-existent, which only amplified the problem. Dirty water, improperly cooked food, and the perpetual presence of lice meant sickness was never far away. Can you picture constantly scratching at your scalp or under your clothes, trying to deal with lice as you trudge through another day of drilling or marching? With no understanding of germ theory, the solutions to these problems were largely useless. Soldiers tried to remedy their sickness with homemade cures or advice passed down from older relatives. Spoiler, none of it really worked. Diarrhea and dysentery were almost guaranteed, and for many those conditions turned deadly because they didn't know the importance of replacing lost fluids. Something as simple as dehydration could spiral into a full-blown crisis. But it wasn't just diseases that made life miserable. It was what they clung to your body and soul afterward. Rheumatism from wet clothes, infections from untreated cuts, and exhaustion from the punishing routine compounded until it seemed as though camp life itself was set up to crush you. And speaking of crushing discomfort, let's not forget the treatment soldiers received if they survived long enough to make it to surgery. Getting wounded in battle wasn't always a death sentence, but it often felt like one. The terrifying truth was that if you were injured in the torso, throat, or head, surgeons could do very little for you. Limbs, however, were a different story. Amputation became the standard response to serious limb injuries. For those who envisioned surgeons using rusty saws in a flurry of splintered bone and screams, you're only partly wrong. Surgeons were actually highly skilled, able to remove limbs in as little as 3 to 5 minutes. And yes, anesthesia was a thing. Soldiers received chloroform, ether, or nitrous oxide to ease the pain, and no procedure was conducted without their consent. Still, the sights and sounds of terrifying sawbones earned battlefield hospitals their grim reputation. The horrors of medicine and disease were rivaled only by the constant hunger for companionship and connection to normalcy. Men formed intense friendships in these conditions, bonds forged in the fires of shared hardship. Letters weren't just written for family. Some soldiers saved their closest words for the comrades who endured the same trials alongside them. There's something oddly human about imagining a Confederate soldier writing home about trading with the Union enemy, or a Union soldier carefully folding a photograph from home, hiding it under his pillowless bedroll as if that would keep him going for another cold night. And who would have guessed? Some camps had their fair share of animal companions. Soldiers adopted pets to ease the emotional and mental weight pressing down on them. Dogs and cats were common, though some units took things a step further. A regiment from Wisconsin famously kept a live eagle, carrying it on its own perch beside the regimental flags. Even General Robert E. Lee wasn't immune to the charm of an animal friend. He reportedly kept a pet chicken that reliably delivered an egg every single day. The fact that these men, surrounded by chaos, could still find comfort in something as small as an eagle or a chicken shows just how much they craved reminders of a world beyond the battlefield. For all its camaraderie and small comforts, the life of a Civil War soldier was one long fight for survival. It's easy to focus on the battles themselves when we talk about the war, the thunderclaps of cannons and swarms of soldiers charging into gunfire. But for every hour spent on the battlefield, days were consumed with just trying to stay alive in camp. The grinding routine, the constant presence of death, and the physical decay took a toll even before soldiers reached the front lines. The realities of dysentery, amputations, drilling, and loneliness forged a kind of soldier different from what we often imagine today. They weren't just warriors. They were survivors, relying on each other and on brief moments of joy, whether that meant a song by the fire or a curiously loyal chicken. And at Gettysburg, these soldiers, malnourished, gnawed by lice, and recovering from illnesses or surgery were the ones who held the line. The death tolls we read today only capture part of the story. The real human cost stretched far beyond the 3 days of carnage. For these men, victory wasn't just about defeating the enemy. It was about enduring the unendurable together. The bonds they formed in the mud and blood are just as much a part of history as the musket volleys and bayonet charges. And those bonds may have been the reason they saw it through to the bloody, grueling end. Over 50,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. That's Gettysburg's grim statistic. But what does it actually mean? What does it feel like to walk a battlefield littered with that many lives shattered, spent, or snuffed out? Numbers like that don't really hit until you picture the scale. Think of a modern football stadium packed to capacity. Then imagine every single occupant wounded, dead, or unaccounted for within 3 days. That's what happened on the fields of Gettysburg, and it's why this battle defines not just the Civil War, but the crushing human cost of war itself. The breakdown is staggering. The Union suffered over 23,000 casualties, including more than 3,000 killed and nearly 15,000 wounded. As heavy as that is, the Confederates fared even worse. 25,000 casualties in total, with just under 4,000 men dead on the ground and thousands more injured and missing. To put it bluntly, these numbers represented entire regiments and brigades reduced to shadows of themselves. For the Confederates, losing such a huge portion of their fighting strength was like cutting their army in half. And for the Union, despite their victory, the cost was immeasurable when you consider what those losses meant on a personal level. Each name on the casualty list tied to a family left behind. The fields where soldiers had fought on July 1st, 2nd and 3rd were now unrecognisable. They weren't just fields anymore, not in the sense you'd think of farmland, full of neat rows of crops. Union and Confederate bodies lay scattered across the ridges and valleys, some moments from death, others already gone. Many of the dead were slumped back where they'd fallen, their blood leaving dark trails in the dirt. Others, in the hurried aftermath of the fighting, had been hastily piled into shallow ditches and covered with loose dirt. But these makeshift burials didn't last long. Dogs and birds took their macabre share, exposing limbs to the sun and heat was an enemy of its own. July in Pennsylvania doesn't mess around. The sun beat down relentlessly in the days following the battle, turning the fields into what one observer called a sea of stench. The smell of rotting flesh carried for miles. Residents of Gettysburg, who had barely begun to process their relief that the fighting had gone elsewhere, were suddenly faced with an unimaginable task: cleaning up. They didn't have a choice. Fields and roads weren't just blockaded by broken fences and shattered wagons. They were clogged with corpses. Livestock lay in heaps where stray shells and bullets had struck barns or pastures. This wasn't just a grim inconvenience. It was a public health crisis on a scale the town had never even imagined. For civilians, the devastation wasn't limited to the grisly task of burying bodies. Gettysburg had been their home, a quiet farming community before the armies swept through. Now, their homes were riddled with bullet holes while their farmland had been trampled into ruins. Kitchens became triage centres where wounded soldiers lay bleeding on dinner tables. Churches turned into makeshift hospitals, their pews stained with blood. Every usable structure was filled with injured soldiers, often with little regard for which side they fought on. Civilians like Elizabeth Thorne, the caretaker of Evergreen Cemetery, who, by the way, was 6 months pregnant during the battle, were thrown into roles they never asked for. Thorne, for her part, buried over 100 bodies in the days following the Confederate retreat, digging graves with the strength few had in those circumstances, and she wasn't the only one. Gettysburg's residents became gravediggers overnight, thrust into an unending cycle of back-breaking labour as they tried to bring dignity to the dead. For the wounded, though, the nightmare had only just begun. Tens of thousands of injured men lay waiting for help, often with gaping wounds untreated for hours, or even days. The Confederate retreat left behind many of their wounded, including soldiers too weak or injured to keep up with the march. A Union private named Cornelius Hitchcock later wrote about seeing a crop field packed with wounded men sprawled in every direction, barely moving under the broiling sun. The Union Army tried to bring order to the chaos, but the sheer scale of it overwhelmed their best efforts. Schools and homes were taken over as hospitals, their floors slick with blood as overtaxed surgeons worked in grim conditions. It's not like they had much to work with. Medical supplies were stretched thin, and antibiotics didn't exist. Once infection set in, the odds weren't great, especially in conditions where flies swarmed open wounds, and water was pulled from wells already contaminated by battle runoff. Many of the amputations performed to save lives turned into drawn-out deaths. Imagine lying on a makeshift operating table, your arm or leg already gone, and realizing the fever creeping up your spine might finish what the bullets missed. For some, the closest thing to relief was morphine, which surgeons dispensed sparingly. Others had to rely on the support of their fellow wounded, not that there was much strength to go around. Soldiers whispered prayers, wrote goodbyes into the sides of their cartridge boxes, or just stared out into the middle distance, resigning themselves to their fate. What's remarkable, though, is how civilians stepped in to help when the official channels fell short. Local women and volunteers from neighbouring towns flooded into Gettysburg following the battle. They cooked, cleaned, and comforted the dying, turning their personal grief into action. One account notes a housewife spending days spoon-feeding broth to a Union soldier she'd never met. A futile effort, as the soldier succumbed to his wounds 3 days later, but one that embodied the quiet heroism Gettysburg somehow inspired in its survivors. The aftermath didn't stop with the human toll. Economically, Gettysburg was wrecked. Livestock had been seized or killed. Fences were burned for firewood. Crops were uprooted or trampled into the mud. Families who were already just scraping by faced a reckoning they never signed up for. And yet, despite everything, the town persevered. The cost was immeasurable, but in their quiet determination to restore some semblance of order, the people of Gettysburg wrote their own kind of legacy. For the soldiers who could still walk away from that battlefield, the memories of those chaotic days followed them. Diaries and letters from survivors paint a bleak picture. Some describe the eerie silence of the battlefield once the guns stopped, how the only sounds were the moans of the dying and the occasional caw of scavenger birds. Others wrote about the sight of comrades left behind, faces already unrecognizable from the heat and decay. One Confederate soldier, reflecting on the carnage, simply wrote, "It was a sight that never leaves you." Gettysburg was more than a battle. It became a kind of blood-soaked turning point, a place where the immense cost of war could no longer be ignored. For the Confederacy, the losses were irreplaceable. After Pickett's charge, Robert E. Lee's once dominant army was left crippled, its aura of invincibility shattered. For the Union, Gettysburg was proof that victory was still possible, though it came at a horrifying price. The bodies left behind weren't just soldiers, they were symbols, a constant reminder of the sacrifice needed to keep fighting, Even today, Gettysburg is remembered less for who won and more for what it cost. Walk that battlefield now, and it's hard to imagine the stench or deafening noise that must have consumed it in July 1863. The rolling hills and tall grass look peaceful, serene even. You'd never guess that those same fields once churned under the weight of cannons and the blood of men who believed deeply that what they were fighting for was worth the sacrifice. So maybe that's Gettysburg's legacy. Not just as a battlefield, but as a place of reckoning, a place that forced a divided country to confront the brutal reality of its own survival, a place filled with loss, but also resilience, where ordinary people stood and endured despite everything they'd seen, everything they'd lost. And in that, Gettysburg became vital not just to the war's history, but to America's, because the price of freedom, it turned out, wasn't just fought for, it was suffered. How can 3 days in one small Pennsylvania town redefine the direction of an entire nation? It's a lot to take in, isn't it? Gettysburg wasn't just another messy, tragic battle in a long line of Civil War carnage. This was something entirely different. The Union victory wasn't only a victory on the ground, it echoed far beyond the rolling hills and clashed armies. Gettysburg brought a massive shift in strategy, morale, and public perception, not to mention a crushing blow to the South's hope for independence. When the dust settled and the bodies were finally cleared, the events of July 1863 had not only changed the war, they'd changed America. To start, let's talk about strategy. Gettysburg marked the end of General Robert E. Lee's ambition to invade the North. Up until this point, Lee had enjoyed an almost mythic reputation in the South. He had led the Army of Northern Virginia through battle after battle, winning victories so decisively that it felt like his forces couldn't be stopped, even when they were outnumbered. The Southern press praised Marse Robert, portraying him as the Confederacy's invincible cornerstone. That reputation came crashing down at Gettysburg, but not because of one grand error. Lee's strategy, to break through the Union center after 3 brutal days, was risky, and the gamble didn't pay off. His invincibility was a mirage, shattered the moment Pickett's charge failed. But it wasn't just the loss of an opportunity. The loss at Gettysburg forced Lee's army into a permanent defensive posture. From that point on, the Confederacy no longer held the ability to go on significant offensives. Instead, it became a matter of holding on to what territory they could still control, all while their resources drained away, piece by piece. It also permanently stemmed Lee's ambitions to sway Northern public opinion by bringing the war to their doorstep. Before Gettysburg, the Confederates had hoped that a successful invasion might drive the North to the negotiation table, especially with mounting pressure on President Lincoln from peace advocates and a Northern public weary of the war's bloodletting. Gettysburg destroyed that dream, putting the Union in control and killing any realistic hope the Confederacy had of making their independence a reality. Now, let's talk morale. Gettysburg wasn't just a matter of numbers and tactics. It was an emotional gut punch to the South and a massive rallying cry for the Union. The defeat hit Confederate soldiers hard. Imagine marching into battle filled with confidence, believing in the momentum of past victories, and then being forced to retreat while carrying only your wounds, exhaustion, and crushed hopes. The psychological impact was not limited to the soldiers. Southerners back home, many of whom were already scraping by on limited food and supplies, heard about Gettysburg, and it sent tremors through their faith in the cause. The South had staked so much on Lee's invasion. It wasn't just a military campaign. It was a last desperate bid to shift the course of history. It failed. And then there was the impact on Northern morale. which had been battered by earlier defeats and relentless stretches of bloodshed. News of the victory at Gettysburg swept through Union newspapers like fireworks lighting up a dark sky. For Union soldiers, it was proof that they could stand their ground against the Confederacy's best. For the public back home, it wasn't just good news. It was confirmation that their sacrifices might mean something after all. After Gettysburg, Union soldiers marched not with a sense of desperation, but with a growing belief that they could actually win this war. We can't ignore how Gettysburg connected with broader events happening at the time. Picture this. While the Union Army was holding the high ground at Cemetery Hill and repelling Pickett's charge, hundreds of miles farther southwest, General Ulysses S. Grant was tightening his grip on Vicksburg. On July 4th, just one day after the guns had gone silent at Gettysburg, the last major Confederate stronghold along the Mississippi River fell to Grant's forces. The timing was extraordinary. Two pivotal Union victories, one after the other. Together, they reshaped the momentum of the war. Vicksburg cut the Confederacy in half by giving the Union total control of the Mississippi River, while Gettysburg demolished Lee's aura of invincibility and left the Confederacy fragile in both numbers and morale. For Lincoln and Union leadership, it wasn't just a victory. It was a signal that the Confederacy's days of defiance might actually finally be numbered. However, for as much as Gettysburg elevated Union hopes, its significance also went beyond the battlefield. The political ripple effects were just as important as the military ones. In the North, the victory rejuvenated support for the war effort, quieting critics who had grown louder as the death tolls mounted. Remember, Lincoln was facing growing pressure from politicians and citizens who wanted an end to what they saw as a hopeless and wasteful conflict. But Gettysburg gave Lincoln breathing room, not just as a commander-in-chief, but as a political leader. It strengthened the resolve of those who still believed in the Union's cause. And, as the news spread far and wide, it contributed to solidifying Lincoln's legacy as a wartime leader capable of seeing the nation through one of its darkest chapters. On the other side of the Atlantic, the Confederate loss at Gettysburg also sent a message to European powers, a message that the Confederacy desperately didn't want them to receive. Before Gettysburg, Lee's invasion had been timed partly in the hopes of impressing Britain and France, both of whom the South hoped might recognize their independence or provide aid. But after this defeat, the illusion of Confederate strength shattered. No European power wanted to back a losing side, and Gettysburg helped reinforce that the Confederacy wasn't the inevitable victor it tried so hard to portray itself as. It was a morale blow that reached beyond the battlefield and deepened the isolation of the southern states, leaving them to face the Union machine on their own. If all of this sounds like Gettysburg scripted the Union's inevitable win, that's because it kind of did. The end of the war was still 2 years away, but July 1863 made one thing crystal clear. The Confederacy was running out of time, resources, and morale. The Union victory didn't mean less war. It meant harder, bloodier fighting ahead, with generals like Grant focusing on grinding down the South's remaining strength. But after Gettysburg, grinding them down seemed possible. Pickett's charge was the high water mark of the Confederacy, the point where they came closest to changing the tide. After that, their advance wasn't stopped. It was reversed. For all its tactical importance, it's impossible to separate Gettysburg from its emotional weight. This wasn't just warfare, it was a brutal reckoning for two causes, one fighting to preserve a nation, the other desperately clinging to a vision of independence tied inescapably to the preservation of slavery. The scale of destruction and loss at Gettysburg forced the North and the South to understand in stark terms exactly what was being fought for. This wasn't a battle for land or resources. By July 1863, it was a battle over the very identity of the United States, what it stood for and what it would become. So, how did 3 days in Gettysburg change the course of American history? Maybe it's this. Gettysburg turned the Civil War from a question of whether the Union would survive into a question of how the Union would win. It ripped away any lingering illusions of Confederate dominance and proved that the Union not only could stand firm, but could strike back. More than that, it gave the Union cause something immeasurable. It gave it hope, not just for victory, but for something even more powerful, a new kind of freedom. And from that hope, a new future began to take shape. Gettysburg wasn't just a battle. It was a brutal test of endurance, belief, and what a divided nation was willing to sacrifice for its soul. The soldiers who fought there didn't just shape the outcome of a war. They set the stage for what America could become. As Lincoln said, "The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here." Their blood forged a path to freedom. Their stories still ripple through history. Remember, history isn't just events. It's people, their courage and their pain. What stories will we uncover next? Thank you so much for listening, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to hear more tales from history. Good night, and I wish you a peaceful journey on your way to dreamland.